Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating battles of the 18th century, a clash that would shape the fate of empires and test the mettle of some of history's greatest military minds. The Battle of Narva, fought on November 30, 1700. This epic confrontation between the Swedish Empire under King Charles XII and the Russian Empire under Peter the Great is a tale of strategic genius, tactical innovation, and the unyielding resolve of warriors on both sides. In the late 17th century, the Baltic region was a cauldron of tension, with various powers vying for control. The Swedish Empire, under the youthful but formidable King Charles XII, had been expanding its territories, while Russia, under the ambitious Peter the Great, sought to break through to the Baltic Sea and secure a maritime outlet for its trade. As we delve into this pivotal moment in history, imagine the frozen landscape of the Baltic region, where snow-covered forests stretched as far as the eye could see, and the Narva River flowed like a lifeblood through the heart of the conflict. The air was crisp and cold, with a hint of wood smoke and gunpowder carried on the wind. It was a time when empires were forged in blood and steel, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. King Charles II of Sweden, barely 18 years old at the time, had ascended to the throne in 1697. Despite his youth, he was determined to defend Swedish interests and expand his empire. Charles was known for his bravery, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to his causes. He would soon face off against Peter the Great, who was equally resolute in his pursuit of Russian interests. Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia since 1682, had been modernizing his country's military and administrative structures. He sought to transform Russia into a major European power, and access to the Baltic Sea was crucial for this ambition. Peter's reforms included the creation of a new army based on Western models, which would eventually become one of the most formidable forces in Europe. As tensions between Sweden and Russia escalated, both sides began to mobilize their armies. The Swedish army, under King Charles XIII, marched towards Narva, a strategic fortress town located in present-day Estonia, then part of the Swedish Empire. The Russians, under the command of Charles Eugene de Croix and Adam Ludwig Lohenhaupt, were also moving towards Narva, intent on capturing the town and securing a crucial foothold in the region. In the months leading up to the battle, both sides engaged in a series of maneuvers, each trying to outmaneuver the other. The Swedes, with their superior training and discipline, moved swiftly through the countryside, while the Russians, with their larger numbers, sought to overwhelm the Swedish forces through sheer force of numbers. The town of Narva, situated on the Narva River, was a key stronghold that controlled access to the Baltic Sea. Whoever held Narva would have a significant advantage in the conflict. As winter approached, both armies prepared for battle, aware that the coming fight would be fierce and decisive. The Swedish army, numbering around 8,000 soldiers, was a well-oiled machine, with experienced officers and men who had fought in previous campaigns. The Russian army, with approximately 35,000 troops, was larger but less experienced, relying on sheer numbers to overwhelm the Swedes. The outcome of this battle would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of the Great Northern War and the future of both empires. As the two armies faced off outside Narva, the fate of Europe hung in the balance, awaiting the outcome of this pivotal confrontation. In the days leading up to the battle, King Charles II rode among his troops, his presence a boost to their morale. He was a young king, but he had already proven himself in battle, and his soldiers admired him for his bravery and leadership. The Swedish army was a finely tuned machine, with each unit working together like clockwork. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they knew it. As the Swedish army approached Narva on that fateful day in November 1700, they were met with a daunting spectacle, a heavily fortified Russian position, its trenches and earthworks stretching across the frozen landscape like a formidable serpent. The Russians had chosen their defensive line with care, anchoring it on the north by the Narva River, whose icy waters glinted like 1,000 tiny blades in the pale winter sun. To the south, a series of steep hills rose up, their snow-covered slopes glistening with a deceptive tranquility. King Charles II, undaunted by the Russian defenses, began to formulate his plan of attack, his mind racing with the strategic possibilities. The young king's confidence was not misplaced. for he had at his disposal an army honed to perfection through years of training and discipline. The Swedish troops, clad in their worn but well-maintained uniforms, moved with a precision that belied the harsh conditions they faced. As they advanced through the snow-covered terrain, the crunch of boots on frozen earth echoed through the stillness, punctuated by the occasional bark of orders or the clatter of equipment. The air was heavy with anticipation, the very atmosphere electric with the promise of battle. On November 30th, 1700, the Swedish army launched a bold assault on the Russian positions, with columns of infantry advancing through the snow in a series of tightly packed formations. The Russians, confident in their defensive preparations, poured heavy artillery fire into the approaching Swedes, causing significant casualties as the snow around them erupted into bloody geysers. Despite these losses, the Swedish troops pressed forward, driven by their discipline and training, their faces set with determination. As they advanced, the sound of drums and bugles filled the air, a stirring melody that seemed to match the rhythm of their hearts. As the battle raged on, the Swedes began to exploit weaknesses in the Russian defenses, finding gaps in the lines and pouring through them with deadly effect. The Russians, despite their numerical superiority, were unable to withstand the ferocity of the Swedish assault, and soon their positions began to crumble. By mid-morning, the Swedes had broken through the Russian lines, and the defenders were in full retreat, their cries of panic and despair carrying on the wind as they stumbled backward through the snow. One notable example of Swedish bravery during this phase of the battle was the actions of Captain Johann Sjöblad, who led a company of grenadiers in a daring charge against a key Russian redoubt. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Sjöblad's men fought their way into the fortification, capturing several guns and turning them on the fleeing Russians with a speed and efficiency that belied the chaos around them. This bold action helped to shatter the Russian defenses, paving the way for the Swedish victory as the defenders' morale began to fray and unravel. As the Russians retreated, they left behind many of their artillery pieces, which were quickly turned against them by the Swedes. The Russian army, leaderless and demoralized, stumbled back through the snow-covered landscape, pursued by the victorious Swedes with a relentless energy that seemed to drive them forward like a force of nature. By the end of the day, the Russians had suffered staggering losses, with estimates suggesting that over 10,000 men had been killed or wounded, their bodies strewn across the battlefield like so many broken toys. In the aftermath of the battle, King Charles XIII rode among his troops, congratulating them on their victory and praising their bravery as they stood tall, their faces flushed with exhaustion and triumph. The Swedish army, though battered and bruised, had emerged triumphant, having defeated a far larger enemy force through their superior training and discipline. As the Swedes regrouped and tended to their wounded, they knew that they had won a significant victory, one that would have far-reaching consequences for the course of the Great Northern War. As the Swedish army regrouped and tended to their wounded, they knew that they had won a significant victory, one that would have far-reaching consequences for the course of the Great Northern War. The Russian army, led by Peter the Great, had suffered a crushing defeat, with estimates suggesting that over 10,000 men had been killed or wounded. The Swedes, on the other hand, had lost around 1,000 men, a relatively small number considering the scale of the battle. The snow-covered battlefield, once a scene of chaos and carnage, was now eerily quiet, with only the occasional cry of the wounded breaking the stillness. In the aftermath of the battle, King Charles VI of Sweden was hailed as a hero, his reputation as a brilliant military strategist and leader cemented. He would go on to lead the Swedish army to several more victories, including the Battle of Klissow in 1702 and the Battle of Frostad in 1706. The young king's decision to attack the Russian army despite being outnumbered had paid off, and his tactical brilliance had caught the Russians off guard. As the years passed, the Battle of Narva became a legendary event in Swedish history, remembered as a symbol of Swedish courage and determination. It was seen as a defining moment in the Great Northern War, a war that would ultimately last for 21 years and involve many of the major powers of Europe. The battle was also seen as a turning point in the career of Peter the Great, who would go on to reform the Russian army and lead it to several significant victories. The Russian Tsar's defeat at Narva had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it would ultimately serve as a catalyst for his military reforms, which would transform the Russian army into a formidable force. The psychological impact of the battle on both armies should not be underestimated. For the Swedes, the victory was a huge morale booster, proving that they could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds and emerge victorious. The battle had also showcased the discipline and training of the Swedish army, which had been honed through years of military drills and maneuvers. On the other hand, the defeat had a devastating effect on the Russian army's morale, leading to widespread desertions and disillusionment among the troops. It is commemorated by a monument in Narva, Estonia, which bears the inscription Specia Memor, or Sweden Remembers. The battle is also remembered through numerous works of art, including paintings and sculptures, which depict the bravery and heroism of the Swedish soldiers. The Nordic Museum in Stockholm has an entire exhibit dedicated to the battle, featuring artifacts such as uniforms, weapons, and personal belongings of the soldiers who fought at Narva. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.